The city was buzzing. As usual, people hurried along the sidewalk, lost in their own worlds. The traffic hum of car engines blended with the chatter of pedestrians. On the corner of a busy street, there was a familiar sight. A homeless man, disheveled and sitting against a building, had been there for weeks. He wasn't causing trouble, he simply existed in the background of the city's chaos. A police officer, making his usual rounds, noticed him. It wasn't unusual to see people like him, but today, something felt different. The officer walked toward the man, his boots hitting the pavement with authority. His face was stern, his mind set on the task at hand. The officer had dealt with situations like this before, people loitering, causing disturbances. But today, there was a specific reason he was here. He knew this man, or rather he knew about him. The homeless man had been warned multiple times, and it seemed like the right moment to do something about it. He approached the man with a steady pace, but the homeless man didn't even flinch. He simply looked up and met the officer's eyes, waiting. There was a calmness about him, but something in the air told the officer that today was going to be different. The officer stood tall in front of the man, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had seen this scene before, but today, there was an edge to it. "You've been warned before," he said firmly, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. "Loitering in this area is against the law. You can't just sit here all day, it's time to move." The homeless man didn't respond immediately. He only shifted slightly, his eyes still locked on the officer's. He wasn't angry or upset, he seemed almost resigned. The officer had seen this kind of thing many times, people who had given up, whose lives had fallen apart in ways no one could understand. The cop shifted his weight, his hand resting near his belt. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to deal with this again, but he had his orders. "I'm just doing my job," the officer muttered under his breath. "This is what I'm supposed to do. It's the law." He glanced around the street, at the busy people walking past, oblivious to the man sitting on the sidewalk. The officer's mind was focused on the man now. Was this what his job was about? Stopping people like him? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. The law was clear. The homeless man had been warned before. This time he was going to have to face the consequences. The officer moved a step closer, his voice becoming more commanding. "I need to arrest you. You're not supposed to be here." His hand hovered near his radio, ready to call it in, but the homeless man still didn't react. Instead he simply spoke. "Why?" he asked quietly. The officer paused for a moment, his grip tightening around his belt. The homeless man's voice had been soft but clear, as if he wasn't speaking out of defiance or fear, but from a place of curiosity. It caught the officer off guard. "Why?" the man asked again, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "Why are you arresting me?" The officer shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to answer. It wasn't a question he had expected. He had been ready to go through the motions, to lay out the charges, maybe even deal with some resistance. But this calm, simple question threw him off track. "You're loitering," the officer finally replied, trying to sound confident. "You've been here for days. People complain. It's against the law." The homeless man nodded slowly, as if processing the words. He didn't argue, didn't challenge the officer's authority. He just looked at him, like he was trying to understand why it had come to this. "I'm not causing any harm," the man said quietly, his voice almost apologetic. "I'm just here, like everyone else. I'm not a criminal." The officer didn't know how to respond. He had expected defiance, or at least an attempt to talk his way out of the situation. But this man wasn't doing either. He wasn't begging for mercy, or getting angry. He was simply speaking the truth. For a brief moment, the officer stood frozen, caught between his duty and the unsettling calm of the man in front of him. The question lingered in the air. Why? Why was this the only way? Why was he here, making this decision? The officer stood still, uncertainty creeping into his thoughts. The homeless man's calmness was almost unsettling. There was no shouting, no pleading for sympathy, just a quiet, steady presence. The officer took a deep breath, preparing himself to continue with what he thought was his duty. But before he could speak, the homeless man spoke again. "You think I chose this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. You think I woke up one day and decided to live like this? The officer blinked, taken aback by the question. The man's eyes were distant now, like he was remembering something far away. He didn't seem to be talking to the officer anymore, but to himself. It was as if he had been waiting for someone to ask, waiting to tell his story. No one chooses this life, the man continued. I had a family, a wife, a daughter. I had a home, a job. His voice faltered for just a moment, before he regained control. But life, it doesn't always go the way you plan. The officer frowned, his hand still hovering near his radio. This wasn't what he expected. He had imagined this would be just another routine encounter, a simple arrest, and then he could move on. But now, there was a part of him that wanted to know more. He didn't speak, just waited for the man to continue. The company I worked for shut down, the man said, his voice heavier now. I lost everything. My wife left me. My daughter, she doesn't even remember me anymore. I ended up here, with nothing, just nothing. The officer was quiet. He didn't know what to say. He had heard stories before, of people falling through the cracks, but this felt different. The man's words were raw, vulnerable, and for the first time, the officer saw him as something more than a nameless figure, sitting on the sidewalk. The officer glanced at the man, his stern face beginning to soften. The questions started to swirl in his mind. How many people like this were out there, just forgotten by the world? How many had fallen through the same cracks? The line between right and wrong seemed less clear now. The officer stood there, frozen, as the homeless man's words echoed in his mind. He hadn't expected this. A simple arrest had turned into something much deeper. He felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over him, like the ground beneath his feet was shifting. For a moment, the officer considered his own role in this. He was just doing his job, right? It was his duty to enforce the law, to maintain order. But as he looked down at the man sitting before him, something didn't sit right. The man's story was so real, so human. His eyes weren't those of a criminal, they were tired, worn, but still full of life. He wasn't some nameless face on the street. He was a person with a past, with hopes, with pain. The officer ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his mind. He had always followed the rules, and the rules were clear. People couldn't just stay on the streets, causing a disturbance. They couldn't sit around all day, taking up space. But this wasn't just about rules anymore. It wasn't about right or wrong in the way he had always seen it. His thoughts started to spin. The homeless man wasn't a threat. He wasn't causing harm to anyone. He wasn't violent. So why was he being treated like one? The officer had been trained to see the world in black and white, to make quick decisions, to follow orders. But now, standing here, looking at this man who had lost everything, he began to question those very rules. A part of him wanted to keep walking, to ignore the man's words, and make the arrest as planned. That was what he was supposed to do. But another part, one he hadn't listened to in a long time, was telling him to stop. To listen, to understand. The officer's grip on his radio loosened. He could feel his resolve starting to crack. The law said one thing, but his instincts, his growing awareness, said something else entirely. He wasn't sure what to do anymore. Would he be betraying his duty if he let this man go, or would he be doing the right thing? The decision felt heavier than ever before. The officer stood there, torn between his duty and the raw truth that the homeless man had just shared. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The hard lines of his uniform suddenly felt stifling, and his usual confidence wavered. He had always been able to separate right from wrong, the black from the white. But now, standing in the gray, he wasn't so sure anymore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The officer could hear the soft hum of traffic in the distance, the faint footsteps of people walking by, oblivious to the small intense exchange happening right in front of them. But to him, it felt like the world had slowed down, as if everything had paused for just a beat. He glanced at the homeless man again, who hadn't moved. He wasn't asking for anything, not even pity. He had simply told his story. It wasn't dramatic or full of emotion, but it had pierced through the officer's armor. The man's calmness in the face of his own hardship, his acceptance, had shaken something deep inside the officer. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the officer took a step back. His mind was racing, his thoughts at war with each other. He had a job to do, but was this really the way to handle it? Could he arrest someone who wasn't a danger to anyone, who was just lost, like so many others? The officer's eyes flickered to the man's weathered face, and something shifted within him. He had heard so many stories over the years, but this one felt different. It felt like the man wasn't just talking about himself, he was speaking for so many others who had fallen through the cracks, who had been forgotten by the system. With a deep sigh, the officer lowered his hand from his radio. The decision felt right, even if it went against what he had been trained to do. "I'm not arresting you," he said, his voice quieter now. The homeless man looked up at him, surprise flickering in his eyes. For the first time the officer saw a flicker of hope in the man's tired expression. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it made something inside the officer shift. He wasn't just a cop anymore, he was a person, facing a choice. And today, he had chosen to see the man as more than just a problem. The officer stood silently for a moment, his decision lingering in the air between them. He had made his choice, but he wasn't quite ready to walk away. There was still a sense of heaviness in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing feeling that he couldn't shake. Had he done the right thing, or had he just let someone slip through the cracks once more, like so many others before? He looked down at the homeless man, who was still sitting there, watching him quietly. The man didn't stand up or offer any words of thanks, he didn't need to. His gratitude was in his eyes, in the subtle shift of his posture. For a moment, the officer felt a quiet connection. It was as if the man understood something that the officer had only just started to grasp, that sometimes, the right thing isn't always the easiest or most obvious choice. The officer took a deep breath and turned to leave, his boots hitting the pavement with a steady rhythm. But before he could take more than a few steps, he heard the homeless man's voice again, this time softer, but still clear. "Thank you," the man said quietly, his words carrying a weight the officer hadn't expected. It wasn't the kind of thanks that demanded attention. It wasn't loud, or dramatic, it was simple, genuine. The officer didn't turn around, but the words lingered in his mind as he walked away. There was no fanfare, no moment of triumph, there was just a quiet realization that something had changed in him, something subtle but undeniable. He hadn't solved the man's problems, he hadn't fixed anything, but in that moment, he had made a choice to see the person in front of him, not the label of homeless or criminal. And that small shift had made all the difference. The officer's patrol car was parked a few blocks away. As he walked toward it, his mind wandered back to the man on the sidewalk. He wondered what had become of him, what his life had been like before the streets had taken over. He thought about how many others there were, people who had been forgotten, who had been pushed aside by society. And yet in the midst of all of it, there was a man, no different from anyone else, who had simply fallen. The officer opened the door to his car, sitting down with a tired sigh. His shift wasn't over, but something inside him felt lighter. The world outside still moved at its usual pace, but he felt like he had taken a small step toward understanding something much bigger than the rules he had been taught to follow. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time, he realized that it wasn't about always being right. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone, even those who seemed invisible, and as he drove off, he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, he had made a difference in that man's life. Even if it was only for a brief moment, it felt like the right choice.